Some pitchers become legends because they dominate for a few unforgettable seasons. Others become legends because they simply refuse to disappear. Jim Palmer belonged to the second group. For nearly 2 decades, he stood on a major league mound and kept winning. The game changed around him. Hitters changed, teammates changed, managers changed. Even baseball itself seemed to be moving into a different era. Jim Palmer remained. He was there when the Baltimore Orioles were building a dynasty. He was there when the pressure of October became unbearable. And when the Orioles needed someone to take the ball in the biggest games, Palmer was often the man standing on the mound. 3 Cy Young Awards, 3 World Series championships, 6 All-Star selections, 268 victories. The numbers are impressive. But numbers alone don't explain Jim Palmer, because Palmer's career was never a straight line. There were injuries, setbacks, moments when his body threatened to take away the career he was still trying to build. There were seasons when he had to fight his way back. And every time baseball seemed ready to move on without him, Palmer returned, not simply to pitch, to win. That became the strange rhythm of his career. He would rise. Something would threaten to stop him, and somehow he would find a way forward. For the Baltimore Orioles, that resilience became invaluable. Palmer wasn't just another starting pitcher. He became the ace of an organization that expected to contend every year. He carried the weight of expectations. He carried the pressure of October, and he carried the reputation of being the pitcher his teammates could trust when everything was on the line. But trust isn't given to a pitcher. It is earned, one start at a time, one difficult inning at a time, one comeback at a time. And Palmer had to earn it over and over again. In 1965, Jim Palmer was still a teenager. He was young enough to be learning how to pitch while standing on a major league mound. The Baltimore Orioles had seen something in him. But potential is not the same thing as greatness. And major league hitters had a way of exposing the difference. Palmer's early years were not the beginning of a smooth climb to the top. They were an education. Every hitter was stronger. Every mistake was punished. Every inning taught him something about what it meant to survive at the highest level of baseball. He had to learn that throwing hard was not enough. A major league pitcher needed control. He needed to understand hitters. He needed to know when to challenge them and when to make them chase. And perhaps most importantly, he needed to learn how to pitch when his best stuff wasn't there. That lesson would become central to Palmer's career, because his greatest strength was never simply one extraordinary pitch. It was his ability to compete. The Orioles were also developing into something special. Baltimore had begun building an organization around pitching, defense, and discipline. Brooks Robinson anchored the infield. Frank Robinson brought power and intensity. Behind them, the Orioles were becoming a team that expected to win. For a young pitcher, that environment mattered. Palmer wasn't being asked merely to survive. He was being prepared to become part of something bigger. But the transition from promising teenager to dependable major league starter would take time. There were setbacks. There were moments when Palmer had to confront the reality that talent alone would not carry him through a long season. And then gradually, the pieces began to come together. His command improved. His confidence grew. His understanding of hitters became sharper. He began to trust his ability to work through difficult situations instead of trying to overpower every batter. The pitcher Baltimore had hoped for was beginning to emerge, because some of the greatest hitters of his generation were waiting for him. Players who could turn one mistake into a home run. Lineups that could make even an experienced pitcher question every pitch. Yet Palmer kept coming back to the mound and kept finding ways to win. Perhaps that's what makes his story different from the stories of so many other great pitchers. Jim Palmer wasn't simply trying to become dominant. He was trying to remain dominant for years, across generations, through injuries, through pressure, through changing baseball, and eventually into the Baseball Hall of Fame. So what allowed Jim Palmer to keep winning when so many great pitchers before him had already begun to fade? What did he understand about preparation, competition, and resilience that allowed him to survive an era that had already produced so many extraordinary pitchers? And how did a teenage pitcher in Baltimore become the enduring ace of one of baseball's greatest dynasties? To find the answer, we have to go back to the beginning, before the Cy Young Awards, before the championships, before Jim Palmer became the pitcher Baltimore trusted most. Back to 1965, when a teenager first stepped onto a major league mound and began a career that would last far longer than anyone could have imagined. By the late 1960s, Palmer was no longer simply a young arm in the Orioles' rotation. He was becoming one of the most important pitchers on the staff, and then the Orioles reached the moment when potential had to become proof. The 1966 season changed everything. Baltimore reached the World Series against the Los Angeles Dodgers. Waiting for them was Sandy Koufax, one of the most dominant pitchers baseball had ever seen. For a young Orioles pitcher, the stage could hardly have been larger, but Palmer was given the ball, and in Game 2 he delivered. Koufax was supposed to represent the Dodgers' overwhelming pitching advantage. Instead, Palmer shut them out. The Orioles won, and the young pitcher from Baltimore had announced himself on the biggest stage in baseball. But that World Series did more than give Palmer his first championship. It showed him something about himself. He could pitch under pressure, he could face the best, and he could win when the entire baseball world was watching. The Orioles swept the Dodgers. Palmer had his first World Series championship before he had even turned 21. It was an extraordinary beginning. But championships can create expectations just as quickly as they create legends. From that point forward, Palmer was no longer simply a promising young pitcher. He was expected to become an ace, and becoming an ace was one challenge. Staying one would be something else entirely, because the next chapter of Jim Palmer's career would not be defined by one great World Series. It would be defined by the years that followed, when Baltimore expected him to win again and again and again. By the early 1970s, Jim Palmer had become something the Baltimore Orioles could build around. The young pitcher, who had once been learning how to survive major league hitters, was now the man opposing teams had to prepare for. But Palmer's rise came at a remarkable time. The Orioles were no longer simply a promising organization. They had become a powerhouse. Brooks Robinson anchored the defense. Frank Robinson had already helped establish the team's winning identity, and now Palmer was emerging as the ace of a pitching staff that could overwhelm opponents without needing to rely on one single star. For Palmer, that meant expectations. Every season began with the assumption that Baltimore would contend. Every important series created another opportunity and another demand. He had to be dependable, he had to take the ball, and most importantly, he had to keep winning. In 1973, Palmer reached another level. He won the American League Cy Young Award. It was the first of three. But the award wasn't simply recognition of a talented pitcher. It was confirmation that Palmer had become one of the defining pitchers of his generation. 2 years later, he won it again. Then in 1976, he won it for a third time. 3 Cy Young Awards in 4 seasons. That kind of dominance is difficult enough to achieve once. Palmer did it repeatedly. But there was something particularly striking about the way he won. He wasn't simply overpowering hitters every night. He worked, he prepared, he studied, he understood that pitching was a contest of decisions as much as velocity. Every hitter presented a problem, every count created a new possibility. Every mistake could change an inning. Palmer's job was to stay one step ahead, and that mindset fit perfectly with the Orioles. Baltimore became known for disciplined baseball. They defended, they pitched, they waited for opponents to make mistakes, and when the game became tight, they trusted their best players to make the next play. Palmer became the embodiment of that philosophy. But his career was never completely comfortable. His body occasionally reminded him that even great pitchers have limits. Injuries interrupted his progress and threatened to slow him down. For many pitchers, that might have been the beginning of the decline. For Palmer, it became another test. He had to recover, rebuild his rhythm, trust his body again, and return to the mound. That ability to return would become one of the defining themes of his career. Because Palmer's greatness wasn't simply that he reached the top, it was that he kept finding his way back there, and Baltimore needed him to. The Orioles were building a dynasty. They would reach the postseason again and again. They would play in October against some of the most talented teams in baseball, and Palmer would repeatedly find himself in the middle of it. 3 World Series championships would eventually become part of his legacy. But championships don't tell us what it felt like to be Jim Palmer on the mound when everything was at stake. Imagine the pressure. The stadium is full. Every pitch matters. The opposing lineup contains hitters capable of changing the game with one swing, and the Orioles turned toward their ace. Palmer takes the ball. He has no guarantee that his best pitch will be there. No guarantee that his arm will cooperate. No guarantee that the next inning won't become the most difficult inning of his season. But he pitches anyway. That was Palmer's gift. Not the absence of pressure, the ability to perform inside it. And as the 1970s continued, something remarkable was happening. Palmer was no longer simply surviving the demands of a long career. He was becoming the pitcher Baltimore could trust across an entire generation. But longevity comes with a price. The longer Palmer stayed at the top, the more his body had to endure. And eventually, the question would no longer be whether Jim Palmer could win. It would be whether he could keep doing it when baseball and his own body started telling him that his best years were behind him. There comes a point in every athlete's career when the game begins asking a different question. Not how good are you, but how much longer can you do this? For Jim Palmer, that question arrived while he was still winning. That was what made his career so unusual. He wasn't trying to recover from one spectacular collapse. He was fighting the gradual erosion that every pitcher eventually faces. The arm doesn't recover as quickly. The body needs more time. The hitters get younger, the season gets longer, and the margin for error becomes smaller. Palmer understood that, so he adapted. He relied more heavily on preparation, on command, on understanding hitters, on knowing exactly what he wanted to do before the ball ever left his hand. He had learned years earlier that pitching was not simply about throwing. Now he had to prove that the same philosophy could keep him successful as his body changed. And somehow it worked. The Orioles continued to trust him. Palmer continued to take the ball, and opponents continued to face the same problem. He was still there. That persistence became part of his identity. A younger pitcher might have had better velocity. Another might have possessed a more devastating breaking ball. But Palmer had something difficult to measure. He knew how to compete. He knew how to manage a game. And he knew how to survive the moments when his best stuff wasn't available. That became especially important in October, because Palmer's legacy cannot be separated from the postseason. He helped Baltimore win 3 World Series championships. He pitched on baseball's biggest stages against some of the greatest players and teams of his era, and each October reinforced the same message. When the pressure increased, Palmer did not disappear. He became more important. For the Orioles, that reliability was priceless. They didn't need him to be spectacular every night. They needed him to give them a chance, and time after time he did. There is a quiet kind of greatness in that. It doesn't always produce the most dramatic highlight. It doesn't always create the loudest moment. Sometimes greatness is simply knowing that when the game matters most, someone will be there. For Baltimore, that someone was Jim Palmer. Eventually, the years caught up with him. No pitcher can outrun time forever. The arm that carried him through thousands of innings could no longer recover the way it once had. The body that had survived injuries could not keep making the same bargain indefinitely. But even as his career moved toward its final years, Palmer's reputation had already become secure. 3 Cy Young Awards, 3 World Series championships, 6 All-Star selections, 268 victories, and a place at the center of one of baseball's great dynasties. Yet perhaps the most revealing statistic was not a number at all. It was the number of times Baltimore kept giving him the ball. Because every time Palmer returned to the mound, the Orioles were making the same statement. They still believed in him, and Palmer kept giving them reasons to. When he finally left the game, he did not leave as the pitcher who had simply accumulated the most victories. He left as something more difficult to define, a standard of reliability, a pitcher who had survived multiple eras, a competitor who had refused to let injuries, age, or changing baseball determine when his story would end. But that still leaves the most important question. Why did Jim Palmer remain so dependable for so long? Was it his mechanics, his preparation, his understanding of hitters, his competitive personality? Or was there something to pair refusal to accept that yesterday's limitations had to become tomorrow's reality? Perhaps the answer lies in the way Palmer approached every comeback. He never needed to become the pitcher he had been. He simply needed to find a way to become the pitcher he could still be, and that may be the real secret behind the man who never stopped winning. Jim Palmer's career can be measured in victories, 268 of them. It can be measured in Cy Young Awards, 3. It can be measured in World Series championships, 3 more. But none of those numbers completely explains why Baltimore still remembers him. Because Palmer's greatest achievement was not simply winning. It was remaining dependable in a sport built on uncertainty. Baseball changes. Pitchers change. Hitters change. Teams change. And eventually, every great player discovers that the body does not negotiate forever. Palmer discovered it too. But whenever the game seemed ready to move on without him, he found another way forward. That is what separates longevity from greatness. Anyone can have one extraordinary season. A few can dominate for several years. But to remain trusted year after year to take the ball when the pressure is greatest and give your team a chance to win, that requires something different. It requires preparation, discipline, confidence, and perhaps most importantly, resilience. Jim Palmer possessed all four. He became the ace of the Baltimore Orioles during one of the most successful periods in franchise history. He shared the field with legends. He faced generations of great hitters. He endured injuries. He returned from setbacks, and he continued to compete long after the easy part of his career was over. That is why his story is bigger than the 3 Cy Young Awards, bigger than the 3 championships, bigger than the 268 victories. Those are the evidence. The story is what happened between them, the difficult starts, the recovery, the pressure, the preparation, the moments when his best stuff wasn't there, but he still found a way to get through the game. That was Jim Palmer. He didn't need baseball to remain unchanged. He changed with it. And perhaps that is why his legacy has lasted. When people remember the great Orioles teams, they remember Brooks Robinson. They remember Frank Robinson. They remember the championships. But they also remember the pitcher who seemed to be waiting for them every October, Jim Palmer. The man Baltimore trusted, the pitcher who kept returning, the competitor who refused to fade. And maybe that is the simplest way to understand his career. Jim Palmer did not spend 2 decades trying to prove that he was the greatest pitcher who ever lived. He simply kept showing up, year after year, game after game, when his team needed him, when the pressure was highest. When his body told him it would be easier to stop, he took the ball, and he kept winning. That is why baseball still remembers Jim Palmer. Not because he defeated time, no athlete can, but because for nearly 2 decades, he made time work harder to catch him. And when the game finally caught up with him, he had already left behind something that time could not take away: the legacy of a pitcher who refused to fade.